you very much for coming for my talk. So it's the first talk of the day, so hopefully it should be interesting. My name is Vivek, and I'm going to be talking about the 7 deadly sins of Wi-Fi security. So is there anyone in the room who's never used Wi-Fi? Okay, everybody uses it, right? Over the past couple of years, Wi-Fi has become ubiquitous and is probably one of the technologies which literally anyone who's getting on the internet uses, right? At home, at office, at your university. So we'll be talking about the 7 deadly sins or the 7 most common misconceptions people have when dealing with Wi-Fi security. Now, before I begin, a quick introduction about myself. This is the part which I call the shameless self-introduction. I started off as an electronics and communications engineer, moved on, specialized in computer security, used to work with Cisco systems almost a decade back as a programmer, then architect, and then started doing security research. I broke WEP Cloaking, which was an encryption mechanism currently owned by Motorola, presented at a bunch of conferences, Defcon, Tourcon, couple of them. Discovered the Caffe Latte attack security shootout contest. I've spoken at most security conferences around the world, Defcon, Black Hat, all the Black Hat editions, many others. And I run SecurityTube.net, which was a free video site which I started, again around 8 years back. And we also now have online courses through our site called Pentester Academy, which is currently a company which I own. And the company's trained around 8,000 professionals from 90 countries. Just a quick snapshot of some of our clients online. I'm also the author of multiple books, most of them on Wi-Fi. Some of them have been translated to a couple of languages. And now we are back, right? So the 7 deadly sins. Let's start with the first one. Hidden SSIDs and MAC address filters. Now, when Wi-Fi came in and people started breaking into wireless networks, what most network administrators said, hey, the reason why people break into our Wi-Fi networks is simply because it seems to advertise itself too publicly, right? So right now, if you have any client device, you can see the list of Wi-Fi networks around. And if you kind of rewind back maybe 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of people used to do script kiddie techniques to try and see if they can break in by trying to connect to every possible network. How many of you still do that at the airport? Try to connect to every open Wi-Fi network and see if you can get internet access, right? So the admin said this is the problem, which is every access point advertises the SSID or the network name. So at that point in the 802.11 standard, there was nothing which would stop an access point from advertising its SSID. So the Wi-Fi Alliance, which is really all the vendors coming in together, said, what if we hide the SSID altogether? What if my access point does not broadcast the SSID? So this is what hidden SSID networks are. Networks where the SSID is not broadcasted by the access point. So how would a client connect to a hidden SSID network? Anyone? Like to make this a bit interactive? Yeah. You'll have to shout. Okay, forget the name of the tool. Theoretically, what happens after this, which allows, let's say, a hacker to uncover the SSID? Anyone? So let's say a hacker is observing a network, right, which has a hidden SSID. The hacker doesn't know the SSID yet. Now, interestingly, whenever an authorized client comes in the vicinity, so let's say this is my home Wi-Fi and my authorized client could be my mobile phone, right? Now, if even the authorized client does not know the SSID, then there's no way it can connect. right? So now the authorized client sends what are called probe request packets. Now, keep in mind, hidden SSID does not mean the SSID itself is not assigned. All that means is the SSID is assigned, but is not advertised, right? The best analogy is, what if you took off the nameplate from outside your house? How would someone find your address? Only someone who knows where you stay, right? That's the exact thing happening here. So in the .11 standard, probe request packets are sent out by the client, and when an access point sees the right SSID in the probe request, it responds back with what is called a probe response packet, which also contains the SSID. Now, tools like Kismet, AirCrackNG, they search the air and try and see probe response packets sent by a hidden SSID AP, right? And when they find that packet, they automatically uncover the hidden SSID. Now, hidden SSID is probably the poster child example of security through obscurity. Just by hiding the presence, you do not secure something better. You just find it more difficult to find, right? And people who studied security, they hear about security through obscurity. This is my personal favorite poster child example. The sad part is that you will still find many best practices document talk about hidden SSIDs, right? The same thing applies for Mac filters. Anyone here, what is a Mac filter? Okay, go ahead. Okay, very good. And on the wired side, to some extent, it might make sense depending on how securely your network is wired, right? On the wired side, people still routinely use MAC addresses for network masquerading and a lot of other interesting things, including port security. Unfortunately, on wireless, does it make sense to use MAC address filters? Anyone? Would it make sense if I actually created a filter using a MAC address of your client, let's say your mobile phone or your laptop? Would it make sense? Why? Okay. But in the case of wireless, right, you are sending your packet into a common broadcast medium. So if a hacker is there in the vicinity, he can actually sniff every frame which is going in the RF vicinity. Unfortunately, the MAC address in the MAC header is sent in plain text. So what that really means is, if anyone is sniffing the air, has the right equipment, has the right software, all of which is freely, readily available, he can actually figure out all the MAC addresses in any wireless frame. And what that allows him to do is find the actual authenticated or authorized MAC address. Now, both of these have been used lesser and lesser in enterprises based on what I've seen, right? We've done a lot of wireless audits. We've consulted with a lot of companies, banks, financial institutions. The sad part is the best practices documents still include them. Now, people ask me, well, just because it isn't secure, should you not use it at all, right? My response to that is, use it, but do not be fooled into thinking that this is improving your system drastically. Just look at this as a hurdle which probably the most naive of wireless attackers will not be able to cross, right? So this helps, but definitely it is not a security mechanism you can reliably bank on. Now, the second sin is WEP still being used. Anyone knows what WEP is? Okay. Is WEP broken? How many of you have cracked WEP using AirCrack or any of these tools? Okay, a couple of you. Now, WEP, unfortunately, was the very first encryption standard on Wi-Fi networks. And really the time when WEP was proposed, cryptographers came up with interesting attacks with which they could crack WEP. Now, WEP has been broken and typically shouldn't be used, but unfortunately still is. Where? handheld devices like barcode scanners, card readers. Quick question, how many of you pay with your credit card or debit card at hotels nowadays? Everyone? Rest of you is all cash? Okay. How many of you have seen them bring a wireless credit card scanner to your table? How many of you know, or rather how many of you do not know, that many of them either use no encryption or still use WEP? Right? So the shocking part is, and this is something which is prevalent pretty much in most smaller restaurants, which is they love to buy these second-hand devices which all the bigger guys have discarded simply because they cannot support WPA and above, right? So when you actually swipe your card, all of that data is being transmitted over the air using web. So anyone in the RF vicinity could actually sniff those packets, go offline, and try to crack it. My favorite, of course, is you wouldn't have to work so hard in order to do that if you're auditing, let's say, I don't know, a restaurant, right? Most of the times, if you go to a restaurant and see a Wi-Fi network with the exact same name as the restaurant, that's the one the credit card readers are actually talking to. The best part is you can social engineer and actually get the passphrase. In most cases, when you actually just tell them you have an important email to send, and if you could just use the Wi-Fi network for a bit, most restaurants might just say yes. So after that, you do not even have to spend time cracking the web key, which of course doesn't take any more than 10 minutes anyway, right? But if you're feeling extra lazy, you could add social engineering and try to see if you can get through. The other place where web is still used is in manufacturing. A lot of places on shop floors, especially which are manufacturing these smaller devices, the handheld scanners, which scan the part numbers and things like that, still predominantly use web. Once again, we did an audit for a manufacturer, a very large one based out of Gurgaon, where what we found that all of these spare part numbers were sent entirely over web. Now, the question is, how does it really help if I crack and figure out the spare part numbers? Interestingly, that specific company was planning for a major product launch, and those specific parts were for that product. So actually an attacker, by getting that information, can actually know the company is planning for a big press release or a launch, which means what do? You buy stock. If it's a publicly traded company, this is as good as having insider info before the big news actually breaks out. Now, as I mentioned, web has been cracked and gone, but these are still places and instances where you'll find web being used more and more. All the attacks on web started as early as 2001. If I remember, at that time, you required roughly 4 to 5 million web-encrypted data packets to crack the web key. I think right now you require around 40 to 70,000, depending on whether the web key is 128 or 64. 128 requires a little bit more. And most web networks can be cracked within probably 5 minutes or less. Okay. Now, we've looked at web, we've looked at hidden SSIDs and MAC filters. Now let's move on to something which is more interesting. Using WPA, WPA2 personal in SMB. How many of you have WPA, WPA2 PSK at your home, office? Universities love it as well, right? Now, interestingly, WPA, WPA2 personal, the major attacks still on it, even though there are some small flaws which have been found, seems to be a dictionary-based passphrase attack. What happens is, on both the access point as well as the client, the user can enter a passphrase between 8 to 63 characters. That goes through a function. It's really a hashing function called the PBKDF2, or the password-based key derivation function. The PBK DF2 is actually used in a variety of different communication, right? Even in some cases, web-based communication. Any place where you want to convert a variable length passphrase into a fixed length key, PBK DF2 is something you'd probably want to use. It's actually an IETF standard. You'll actually find an RFC. Now, how does WPA2 cracking work? What the attacker does is he goes ahead, sniffs the air, and actually grabs what is called the WPA four-way handshake. Think of this as the initial phase where both parties are deriving the same encryption key, right? So this is going to be the PTK, or the pairwise transient key, or the session key, based on a commonly known secret to both parties, which is the pre-shared passphrase. Now, interestingly, if we go back 4 or 5 years, at that time, whenever you said a dictionary attack, people didn't worry too much about it, right? Because of course, by definition, that probably means you have to have the capability to go through a large number of iterations within a reasonable amount of time for this attack to be potent in any way. So what changed in the last 5 years, which now enables any attacker with even minimal financial resources to conduct a really strong and potent dictionary attack? And before I actually, maybe request someone to try and answer that, quick question: how many of you have a 63-character passphrase for your Wi-Fi? 50, 40, 30, 20? No one? 2 people? Okay. Most estimates actually show it varies anywhere between 8 to 13 characters. And you can actually write out yours and figure out. The simple reason is because you want your passphrase to be something which can be conveyed verbally, right? You probably don't want to mix up too many upper cases and lower cases, because again, it makes it difficult to probably convey that to your friend or whoever wants to use your home Wi-Fi. So, unfortunately, as we've seen in this small sample, that by default, most people end up picking up, right, a rather small passphrase. How many of you ensure that you're trying to use uppercase, lowercase, maybe some of the other special characters, whatever is allowed, in the passphrase? Okay, couple more. Now, what changed which actually makes dictionary attacks so potent in today's world? What changed in the last 4 to 5 years? Anyone? How many of you have actually tried to conduct a dictionary attack? I think only those people would know the pains of having to generate a dictionary or go through it. Okay. What changed is basically cloud computing came. Now, if I asked you how much would it cost to probably buy a server with 60 gigs of memory, 88 cores, right? Roughly, which has probably a 10 gig Ethernet connection, maybe even connected to the internet, along with a couple of terabytes of hard disk. How much would you estimate? Most of you probably already lost me, right? You're never going to buy that. How much would this cost you if you wanted to buy a machine of this size? Roughly the last time I probably checked, anywhere between 2 to 4.5 lakhs. And of course, it's a server grade machine, right? This isn't a desktop. Now, interestingly, what cloud computing did and changed is it made such really powerful instances of machines available to anyone. How much do you think it actually costs to rent out these machines, let's say on a daily basis? The cost for the really extra large instance, which has more memory than the one I just mentioned, is just $2.50 an hour, right? Now, we don't have time for calculations, but if I actually calculated the PBK DF2 and tried different instances of passphrases, the rough estimate based on what we've run this on Amazon's clusters will actually give you, for each of these machines, 1 billion passphrases a minute. That's what you can try. Right? How many of you have used Amazon EC2 App Engine, right? So you know that you can rent out these machines at any time. You can spin them off. Now here's the interesting part. So let's say you wanted to try 1 trillion passphrases. Do you want to run this machine for the next 5 days? Can you bring down the time even more? Forget optimizing the algorithm. What is the best part of cloud computing? It doesn't matter if you run one machine for 5 days or 5 machines for 1 day, the cost is the same. Apart from the initial cost of boot up, which kind of amortizes over time, the cost which you incur is actually the same. So what that means is, just with a $100 budget, which is almost nothing, you could probably try a couple of trillion passphrase combinations against the captured WPA handshake, right? Now, most of you aren't going to do that. So let me also give you the solution in case you're never going to do that. Maybe it's laziness, maybe it's just the fact that you hate spinning up machines and configuring them. Just go to cloudclacker.com, right? Upload your hashes, and just for $17, they'll actually do it for you. Right? So the best part really is, as a pen tester or as a security researcher, a lot of times you might not even have to spend time trying to create a full infrastructure. As much as I would recommend doing that at least the first couple of times, right? Do not end up becoming a user of technology when you actually want to be an auditor of technology, right? So always ensure that you first know the nitty-gritty details before trying to automate things or use ready-made solutions. It's absolutely a bad idea from a learning perspective. So what has really changed is this, but here's my question. So it's proved that if you have a reasonably weak passphrase, it's going to be cracked. Frankly, even a reasonably strong one. Now let's say I go into an SMB, right? An SMB which uses WPA, WPA2 roughly would be up to around 100 users. 200 and above people prefer enterprise, which is something I'll talk about as well in just a bit. My question is, I go and I explain this, I crack the existing passphrase, and then after that, the admin tells me, hey Vivek, I'm going to go ahead and have a 63-character passphrase with the most jumbled up stuff in there, right? I'm probably going to write a program to automate it all, right? And that's fair. That's absolutely fair as a statement. But my question is, should the SMB still use WPA, WPA2 PSK? Assuming the passphrase is as long and complex as it can possibly be, and also assuming that you probably hence will not be able to crack it using computing resources available to you, right? Unless you're the NSA or the CIA. In which case you already know about a backdoor. It's not that you'll spend that much time, but should we use WPA, WPA2 PSK in SMB? Anyone? So here is a hint. There is a reason they called it personal, right? WPA, WPA2 PSK is called WPA personal. Why did they call it personal? So if we go back here, notice one thing. If, assuming this is a company, right, all of us would share the same passphrase, right? Interestingly, what that actually means is that when you talk to the access point and I capture your handshake, because I also know the passphrase, I can go ahead and figure out and derive your encryption key, right? So WPA, WPA2 PSK it does not provide security between peers. And what that means is, you as the IT consultant can actually read everything I send over Wi-Fi as the CEO of the company. Frankly, every single person can read or decrypt every other person's communication sent over Wi-Fi. Do you need a special tool for this? No. How many of you used Wireshark? Wireshark can do this for you automatically. Once you actually enter the passphrase in Wireshark settings, Wireshark will automatically go ahead, create the session key for every client AP pair it sees for that specific network, right? So the big problem in using WPA, WPA2 PSK is insider attacks. If you share it with someone, make sure you're happy, kind of, knowing that they probably know everything you're doing online over Wi-Fi. How many of you would be comfortable with that? With your friends, colleagues? No one? Shows the amount of trust remaining in the world today. Okay, so now come to WPA Enterprise. How much time do I have? 10 minutes. Okay, got to be fast. I'm still just in the fourth sin. So WPA Enterprise, and this one is classic, right? Because when you go to a larger enterprise, and those are the people who finally pay you, so you finally go to them, this is what they have. Now, WPA Enterprise, as you can clearly see, has 3 entities: supplicant, authenticator, authentication server. I won't get into the messages, but looks complicated enough, right? This is how PEEP, the world's most popular WPA enterprise solution, looks like. It basically works like SSL. There is a tunnel creation, and then inside that, an inner authentication protocol is sent. Now, if someone tells you this is what is being used in your organization, what is your first response? Peace of mind, right? Because the moment we hear something so complicated is protecting us, you probably think you're secure. Now, what I've seen over the years is when something is really very complicated, you also understand so less of it that you probably configured it completely wrong, right? So complicated technology is a sword which cuts on both sides. Now, in all our audits which we've actually done, we found it's much more easier to break into networks which run WPA Enterprise. The resolution isn't large enough, but really in the case of PEEP or EAP TTLS, there are multiple options available. The first of it is validate the certificate, right? Of course, you want to have certificate validation. And then you also have do not prompt the user to authorize. Can't see that. So my question is, this is really the most common configuration I find in most enterprises around the world, right? Which is validate certificates, do not prompt users to accept new certificates or to accept new certifying authorities. And that's completely fantastic, right? That's really what you want. You want it to be completely idiot-proof, which is the user cannot do anything. Unlike in the case of SSL, where even if you have an SSL MITM going on, the user still has the last say, which is he can actually accept the certificate, right? It could be a fake cert. But my question is, I wish this could be more clear, but my question is this a secure config? And unbelievably, I've even seen this config in Fortune 500 companies around the world, in the US and in Europe majorly. Is this secure? You are validating the certificate, and you basically are never going to prompt the user to accept new certificates. Now, interestingly, there is one very critical component missing here, right? If you notice, in connect to these servers, I don't have the server names. So what this means is, all I need is a valid certificate issued by one of these guys. So for a very long time, including even now, when we actually do pen tests or security audits, we have our own valid certificate from Thwarte, which basically is installed as the CA for all MS platforms, almost 99% of the times. And then we create a PEEP EAP TTLS honeypot using that cert. So now what happens? When the client connects, if the client is misconfigured with this, which is what a ton of clients are, and if you come from an enterprise, I'd highly recommend you go back and check your enterprise config. If that happens, the client will happily connect because now it's being shown a completely valid certificate, right? The case where probably we aren't using a valid certificate is same as SSL man-in-the-middle attacks, which is you get a pop-up on the client, you are allowed to accept or deny, right, using that certificate. How many of you use an Android? Most Android platforms, by default in your config, it'll actually accept any certificate. So go change it, right? And we love Androids because it's so easy to go ahead and do an MITM. All the demos and all the videos is available on my site, securitytube.net. I supposedly even have the largest free video series of around 9 hours, from where you can actually look at all of these attacks. Okay, I'm just going to go real fast. Secure infrastructure, not clients. Now, the problem is when people think enterprise security, they almost mistakenly only think about the enterprise premise. So when people look at Wi-Fi security, they look at their premise and they say, hey, all I need to protect against is rogue APs, misconfigured APs, misassociation attacks, ad hoc attacks, and all of this, people still look at it around the enterprise vicinity, right? What happens to all of those hundreds and thousands of mobile devices which also carry enterprise data? How many of you check your office email on your phones, right? On your laptop, which you actually take home, and which you also try to connect to every free network you actually can find when you're at an airport or a coffee shop, right? The same device is actually being used. Now, this is really where what we forget is that